As you, the viewer, must know by now, the US presidential election has been in full swing these past few months. We have all had to bear witness to the embarrassing presidential debate between Biden and Trump, which has garnered widespread ridicule and shame on both sides of the political aisle. Facing the stunning mediocrity of the 2024 presidential candidates, it comes as no surprise that the reactions of so many working class Americans to this debacle varies between, "Is this real?" "Neither of these candidates represent my interest in any way," and "surely we can do better than this." In response to these questions, we say not only can we do better, we must do better. What we will propose in this video is an ideal candidate, Candidate X, as the President of the United States to assume office in 2025, who is here to unite the working class Americans by offering them a realistic, pro-working class alternative to the narratives that are currently on the table. A leader who has the best interest of all decent, hardworking Americans in mind, who comes armed with a plan of action that the 99% can get behind. What would such a candidate even look like? Let's find out. Good evening. Tonight we are speaking with United States Presidential Candidate X. First question to Mr. X. The price of essentials has increased. For example, a basket of groceries that cost $100 then now cost more than $120, and typical home prices have jumped more than 30%. What do you say to voters who feel they are worse off under your presidency than your opponents?
The decline in the American people's quality of life is by no means limited to Biden's administration. The 20% increase in the cost of groceries in the last 4 years is the continuation of a decades-long assault leveled against the working class of this country by the ownership class. As the cost of living has risen each and every year, wages have remained utterly stagnant. For the 80% who live paycheck to paycheck and the 50% who lack the savings to withstand a $500 emergency, the fight for survival has become desperate. Those who previously managed to save money in the hopes of one day owning their home have been undermined by the fact the cost of food has gone up $700 a month in the span of just 2 years. Meanwhile, the billionaire class has grown their wealth by $3.3 trillion in the last 4 years. The time is now for us to come together and put an end to the American economy working only for the ultra-rich. Immediately after taking office, we will close every tax loophole used by the rich to avoid paying their fair share. We will outlaw the starvation wages that multinational corporations have gotten away with paying for far too long. No longer will American taxpayers be forced to subsidize corporations such as Amazon, where 1 in 3 workers depend on welfare to survive. The federal minimum wage will become a federal living wage, to finally ensure a fair day's work is compensated with the means to pursue the American dream. Together, we will build an economy that serves all of us, not just the privileged few who have exploited the people for far too long.
Trump wants to impose a 10% tariff on all goods coming into the U.S. How will you ensure that doesn't drive prices even higher?
It's undeniable that free trade agreements of the past few decades, like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, for example, are benefiting the ultra-rich and their multinational corporations at the expense of the American people. Our livelihoods have been severely undercut by these corporations, exploiting the absence of legal protection for workers abroad. American jobs have been shipped overseas in the sole pursuit of profit. And what is more, if we dare to organize and demand fair compensation, these oligarchs threaten to eliminate all of the remaining jobs in the same manner. We must fight against this immoral practice which seeks to permanently disempower us from seeking just pay or risk the permanent destruction of our livelihoods. Applying severe tariffs to combat these predatory corporate practices not only will fail to address the fundamental issue, it is also guaranteed to hurt everyone who is not part of the ownership class. These tariffs will increase the cost of living in America, disproportionately impacting the most vulnerable among us. Under my administration, the interests of the American people will finally be brought to the forefront. We will impose punitive taxes on corporations outsourcing their production overseas rather than manufacturing at home. We will cut federal subsidies for corporations which do not invest in domestic manufacturing and the livelihood of Americans. Together, we will confront the corporations inflicting irreparable damage to our economy and put an end to the ultra-rich who are only looking out for themselves.
With the U.S. facing trillion-dollar deficits and record debt, why should top earners and corporations pay even less in taxes than they do now?
Obviously, they shouldn't. Those pushing for the billionaire class and megacorporations to pay even less in taxes reveal their allegiance in the war against the American working class. In the last 40 years, CEOs have gone from making 50 times the wage of workers to nearly 400 times what workers are paid. Every man is entitled to the sweat of his brow, but no man can work 400 times more productively than the average worker. This fact of life should be reflected in the wages of everyone across the board. The natural order of things is being violated and subverted to an outrageous degree. While tens of millions struggle to survive, billionaire wealth has doubled in the last 4 years and corporations are reporting record profits. 806 individuals own almost twice the wealth of the bottom 65 million American households. To promote further tax cuts for these oligarchs is a betrayal of the American people. Today, the ultra-rich and their corporations use egregious loopholes in our tax system to pay a far lower rate than those under their employ. We will put an end to these self-serving schemes. It is time to close the tax loopholes that burden American workers with an unjust share of the deficit and national debt. When I am elected, we will restructure the tax system to guarantee that the wealthy pay their fair share. We will place billionaires in the highest tax bracket with no exceptions. We will create tax laws that incentivize corporations to pay their workers honest, respectable wages. The United States will never eliminate its deficit by catering to the financial elites. We will do it by raising taxes on the elites and our corporations.
As president, would you block abortion medication?
No. The politicization of abortion medication is an expression of absolute contempt for women. Organized religious groups that reject the separation of church and state are determined to impose their beliefs on all women at any cost. The Bill of Rights directly forbids this. As Americans, we are the last bastion for people who seek refuge from tyrannical masters and dogmatic zealots alike. We will not stand by and watch the rights of our citizens be eviscerated by vindictive religious radicals. We will enforce the wishes of our founding fathers and maintain the separation of church and state. We will fight against any efforts to block abortion medication, and we will restore the legal status of choice.
Do you support any legal limits on how late a woman should be able to terminate a pregnancy?
As I stated before, once I assume office, I will dedicate myself to enforcing the wishes of our founding fathers by maintaining the separation of church and state as outlined within the First Amendment. That encompasses the bodily autonomy of our citizens, including the legal status of abortions, free of government intervention. Whatever fair and reasonable restrictions are involved in pregnancy termination, those were already outlined and clear to everyone under Roe v. Wade, before it was torn down. It is the intolerant and vindictive religious groups who were responsible for its repealing and who are now pushing for even more restrictions on us. There are two things to understand about these religious radicals. One, they will not be satisfied until we are all on our knees, praying for absolution to crimes we didn't commit. And two, it is abundantly clear that they are not pursuing these restrictions out of concern for the well-being of women. For if they were, rather than fixating on making abortions more difficult for women, they would respect their rights. The facts are that 60% of women who seek abortions already have at least one child. They know the costs. 73% of women who have received an abortion have cited financial hardship as a leading factor in making this decision. It is apparent that these religious groups would rather satisfy their fantasies by inflicting their beliefs upon the rest of us regardless of our free will. They are hell-bent on bringing us back to the Dark Ages. It is a telltale hallmark of a tyrant that they would rather eliminate freedom of choice than to see to the raising of livelihood to a level where people can choose for themselves. That is because the question of abortion ties into the ongoing cost of living crisis and the cost of childcare that is impacting all who are not wealthy. Our administration will focus on building economic prosperity among the working class, so that we are all empowered to make the best decisions we can in pursuit of happiness, rather than be forced to make these hard decisions under the duress of extreme economic inequality.
A record number of migrants have illegally crossed the southern border on Biden's watch, overwhelming border states and overburdening cities such as New York and Chicago, and in some cases causing real safety and security concerns. Given that, why should voters trust you to solve this crisis?
The administrations of our opponents have utterly failed to provide a robust, end-to-end solution for the immigration crisis we are facing. Donald Trump has called to build the wall, and Joe Biden halted the construction of the wall and implemented the catch-and-release policy that has disempowered our border agents from preventing illegal border crossings. In order to preserve our nation, we must control and determine our own borders. With millions of illegal border crossings every year and over 10 million undocumented aliens, our leaders have created a situation that is currently untenable. They have not only failed to secure the border, they have failed to provide a reasonable plan of action for the undocumented migrants that are currently here. The Biden administration has set up court dates for undocumented immigrants nearly a decade after their first contact with government officials. The Trump administration has forwarded the absolutely unrealistic and tyrannical policy of executing mass deportations. The lunatics are running the asylum, and it will no longer be tolerated. We must establish a realistic roadmap to get the border under control and to address the 10.5 million undocumented immigrants in our country. My administration will empower border control and allocate funds to minimize illegal crossings. After that, we will create a special program with enhanced protections for undocumented immigrants to register with the United States government. Varying degrees of documentation and short-term renewable stays will be granted to those that come forward, the lengths of which will be a function of their demonstrable merit. When this special program ends after 12 months, any undocumented migrants encountered by law enforcement will be believed to have willfully evaded a good faith effort of the United States to give them a clear path to legal residence and will be deported. The American people are more than justified to distrust the status quo leadership to handle the immigration crisis, because they have failed to produce a reasonable plan ready for implementation. When I am elected, we will implement a strong and rational approach that gives migrants, who are here to build a life for themselves and contribute to our society, a path to citizenship, and to identify and deport bad actors who would abuse our institutions for their own selfish gain.
On the topic of immigration, Trump said that he is going to carry out, quote, the largest domestic deportation operation in American history, unquote. Will you deport every undocumented immigrant in America, including those who have jobs, including those whose spouses are citizens, and including those who have lived here for decades? If so, how?
Donald Trump's desire to enact mass deportations is a reflection of his generalized oppression of working Americans. He is either willfully ignorant of the negative impact his policies have had on us, or is actively seeking to enrich himself and his cronies at our expense. The implementation of mass deportations will require a shocking degree of tyrannical practices, the violation of our constitutional rights, including the Fourth Amendment, and have a 100% guarantee of massive negative repercussions on our economy and the lives of innocent American citizens. This policy suggestion is fantastical and unrealistic, and serves as yet another example of the former president making a foolish attempt to address the legitimate issues we face today. We must come together to correct the course on our strategy of addressing the over 10.5 million undocumented persons here in America. We the people shoulder this burden, not the elites who threw us into this mess. Honest, hardworking migrants are taken advantage of by criminal corporations and businesses, who pay them starvation wages and ignore basic workers' rights. These insidious practices harm American citizens and legally documented immigrants alike, killing jobs and driving unjust wages even lower. We can also not afford to ignore concerns about the undocumented who seek to abuse our system, harming our economy and communities. When I take office, I will first and foremost act to get the border under control and stop the propagation of these issues. Secondly, I will recruit a panel of experts to generate a time-boxed special program, which will give undocumented persons a fair chance to come forward and register. We will enhance the protections around undocumented immigrants who come forward and grant a temporary renewable status for those who can demonstrate they are contributing value to our communities. Once in the system, we will create a pathway to long-term legal residency, including visas, green cards, and citizenship. Any undocumented migrants who choose to disregard these efforts to bring them into the fold will be believed to be acting against our interests and will face legal consequences, including deportation.
Russian President Vladimir Putin says he'll only end this war if Russia keeps the Ukrainian territory it has already claimed and Ukraine abandons its bid to join NATO. Are Putin's terms acceptable to you?
We do not need to cater to the whims of Putin to bring this war to its much-needed end. Before the previous administrations involved themselves, sending us down the path of war and insecurity, Russia and Ukraine were able to establish not one but two separate peace treaties, the first in 2019 and again in 2022. I will not bow down to the private will of the military-industrial complex. The United States will regain its status as a world leader in the quest for peace and stability globally and in the region. Under my presidency, we will seek an immediate ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia and bring these nations to the negotiation table. We will recruit support from the international community, with the explicit intention of creating lasting peace and stability, as is in the world's best interest. In conjunction with ending the war in Ukraine, we will seek to reduce tensions with Russia and pull back from this modern brinkmanship that is threatening the world with nuclear Armageddon. We will take the billions of dollars that we are currently spending on overseas wars and use that money to fight the war on poverty and destitution here at home.
In October, Hamas attacked Israel, killing more than 1,000 people and taking hundreds of hostages. Among those held and thought to still be alive are 5 Americans. Israel's response has killed thousands of Palestinians and created a humanitarian crisis in Gaza. So, what additional leverage will you use to get Hamas and Israel to end the war?
Stating that Israel's response has killed thousands of Palestinians is intentionally misleading and hiding the truth of what is happening in the region. Israel has massacred tens of thousands of Palestinians and wounded over 100,000 more, including women and children. Over 50% of the civilian infrastructure now lies in ruin. Famine is rampant. 2 million refugees have been displaced. Those that remain have had their access to electricity and clean water greatly diminished. In 2006, the conservative Prime Minister David Cameron called Gaza an open-air prison, and Israel's continuous military campaign has made the situation ever more desperate for the people of Palestine. We condemn the terror perpetrated by Hamas against Israeli civilians on October 7th and their extremist, fundamentalist government. However, Israel has violated international law consistently in cases such as the illegal settling and policing of the West Bank, as well as in their brutal and ever-hardening military occupation of Gaza. Netanyahu's conservative coalition, the most right-wing in the history of Israel, has demonstrated a total lack of interest in de-escalating this conflict and active resistance towards the implementation of a two-state solution. What we as representatives of the free world must do is rebuild the reputation of morality and credibility that our current officials have tarnished among the international community. My administration will commit to winning back the goodwill and trust of the world's nations, which has been lost as a consequence of our imperialistic foreign policy. These policies, including the blind pursuit of Zionism, have failed to create a safer world. The time to put an end to these policies is now. We will set a new standard for American foreign policy across the globe, including defining requirements for any further financial or military support for Israel. These conditions must include a guarantee of returning to the negotiation table with Palestine and goodwill, earnest steps towards a two-state solution in line with the recommendations of the international community.
Would you support the creation of an independent Palestinian state in order to achieve peace in the region?
Yes, in order to create a lasting peace in the region, we must put a decisive end to racial segregation and apartheid in Israel. Thus far, Israel has absolutely failed to make a good faith effort to support the internationally recommended two-state solution. Under the Netanyahu administration, Israel has consistently violated international law and has abandoned the principles and morals that the United States stands in support of and expects from its closest allies. Under my administration, we will put an end to the no-strings-attached financial and military support of Israel. In order for any aid to continue, we will demand Israel's military de-escalation and honoring a two-state solution. We will stand by the will of the American people and use our influence to bring about a ceasefire and to bring Israel into alignment with the international consensus. We will require Israel to support the Palestinians in the task of establishing a newly elected government in Gaza, to end the military occupation of the Gaza Strip and ongoing adherence to international law.
Black families still earn far less than white families. Black mothers are still 3 times more likely to die for pregnancy-related causes. And Black Americans are imprisoned at 5 times the rate of white Americans. What do you say to Black voters who are disappointed that presidents haven't made more progress?
The reason for this is racism. There is a long and ongoing history of Black oppression in the United States. We were built on it. Black families have been struggling for hundreds of years against this system. I admit I cannot fix racism. What I can and will do is implement the changes needed to ensure a future of true equality. My new approach tackles these on 3 levels: social, economic, and personal health. Number 1, we will reform our tax system to ensure the rich pay their fair share, including a significant inheritance tax, on the order of at least 90% after the first $2 million. That sum will be invested transparently in low-income communities in the form of community centers, providing critical funding in public schools, and investing in technical education and scholarships to provide avenues for these communities to pursue the American dream. Number 2, we will demand corporations and businesses pay a fair living wage. We will also create tax incentives for workers to be paid a respectable percentage of executives' pay. Number 3, we will reform our criminal justice system by shifting from punishment to rehabilitation in line with the rest of the developed world, and encode enhanced oversight of our police departments into law, including implementing policies to prevent abuses of authority and an increase on the scope of mandatory training with a focus on de-escalation. Number 4. We will repair our broken healthcare system by joining the 97% of developed countries to finally introduce universal healthcare, which serves the people rather than the interests of big pharma. It is time to make our country work for the general will, not the will of private elites. These are policies designed to bring the 99% together and demand a better life, equal opportunity, and the respect and representation they deserve.
2023 was the hottest year in recorded history, and communities across the country are confronting the devastating effects of extreme heat, intensifying wildfires, stronger hurricanes, and rising sea levels. Will you take any action as president to slow the climate crisis?
Climate change is one of the most significant existential threats facing our world. Under our wasteful, hyper-consumerist, predatory capitalist society, we have decimated many of the natural resources we depend on to survive. Almost 90% of global marine fish stocks are now fully exploited or overfished. Over 100,000 acres of rainforests are destroyed each and every day. Experts are now saying that our industrialized farming practices have left us with as few as 60 years of farmable topsoil. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change has predicted a global temperature increase between 2.1 and 2.9 degrees Celsius by the year 2100, exceeding the critical 2-degree point of no return. These are existential threats that our leaders have failed to address. Without bold, solution-oriented leadership on the global stage, to bring the international community together in agreement on decisive action, our leaders will continue to drive us towards the abyss. To combat climate change, the Paris Accord is a good place to start, but we will not stop there. Under my administration, the United States will stand as the gold standard by building our economy with new sustainable practices that will inspire the world to follow in our footsteps. We will allocate resources to the research and development of new green energy solutions. We will expand existing methods and create new ways to clean our air and water. We will invest in infrastructure and modernize our power grid. And we will lead the world in the task of pioneering new agricultural and farming practices. Additionally, we will seek out solutions to temper our unsustainable hyper-consumerist tendencies by legislative means, for instance by guaranteeing every consumer's right to repair their own property. We have the potential to set future generations up with not only clean air and water, robust topsoil, and a thriving natural habitat, but also a healthy economic environment that will revive the American dream. All we need is dedication to long-term planning and the courage to commit ourselves to change. Together, we can change our destiny, for the sake of ourselves, our children, and the future of our country and the world at large.
As president, Trump swore an oath to, quote, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. What do you say to voters who believe that he violated that oath through his actions and inaction on January 6th, and worry that he'll do it again?
Any presidential candidate who refuses to accept the outcome of a fair election and chooses to incite violence in order to overturn the result of the election must be held criminally accountable for their actions, including being barred from eligibility to run for future office. Any such instance of this will not be tolerated. Donald Trump's actions and impotence on January 6th have demonstrated he is not fit to hold the office of United States President. An honest reading of the events could easily produce the conclusion that Trump was attempting to deface our democracy by obstructing the peaceful transition of power. The more generous interpretation is that he failed to adequately uphold his sacred oath. We must demand our leaders not only be held to the highest of standards, but also accountable to our most critical democratic institutions. Those who would subvert the rules and processes we have established for ourselves in the name of common good are a threat to our democracy.
After a jury convicted Trump of 34 felonies last month, he said if reelected, he would have every right to go after his political opponents. We have asked him to clarify what he means by this. Do you think he has the right to go after his political opponents?
This question has missed the mark entirely. A better question is, do the American people have the right to seek justice on corrupt politicians? The answer to this question is yes. The ethical standards of our leaders on both sides of the political aisle is unacceptable. The pervasiveness of dishonesty and corruption that we have seen come to light in recent years cannot be allowed to continue. From the viciously hateful rhetoric espoused by both parties that has polarized our country to the breaking point, to the failure to defend our government agencies from capture by the legalized bribery known as lobbying. From the widespread censorship of free speech on social media platforms, to the concealment of critical information that would allow for a well-informed citizenry. From the prosecution of whistleblowers like Edward Snowden, Chelsea Manning, and Julian Assange to the failure to address the crimes these individuals revealed. From the deference of justice in favor of the interests of the ultra-rich, in cases like Purdue Pharma and its executives' role in the opioid epidemic, to the everyday betrayal of our interests, where the wealthiest campaign donors enrich themselves. The lies and injustices left unheard and uncorrected in this country are a mountain, and it is high time for us to level it. Once elected, my administration will end the abhorrent corruption that has defined our politicians for far too long. We will demand leaders that are upstanding, honest, respectable, and accountable to the people, and underwrite these values into law. Under my administration, the United States government will finally work for the American people.
If nothing is done to Social Security, seniors will see their benefits cut in just over 10 years. Will you name tonight one specific step that you're willing to take to keep Social Security solvent?
It should come as a surprise to no one that, when there are changes in the budget that need to be made, the first and only instinct of our leaders is to cut the social programs that so many Americans depend on. There are other solutions, of course, but they will never be brought to the table by leaders who prioritize private interests over the general will. Immediately after taking office, we will reform the tax system by raising taxes of the richest among us, not the working class. We will close the loopholes the rich have used to avoid paying their fair share. The top 800 billionaires have more wealth than the bottom half of Americans. This dynamic has been created by unprecedented greed and a failure of our leaders to defend us against these egomaniacal actors. These increases will, in part, help fund Social Security. We will additionally seek alternative means to fund these critical social programs. We currently spend more on our military budget than the next 10 countries combined. We will examine our overinflated military budget, for which the Pentagon has failed the last 6 annual audits, and reallocate these funds to be used at home. The time has come to stop spending billions overseas in pursuit of questionable motives and invest in the lives of Americans. We will also address the growing problem of Social Security, being the last hope for many Americans to survive. We need to reverse the disturbing trend, where more and more Americans are skeptical of their ability to retire at all. We will raise the minimum wage so that workers are paid an honest living wage. We will also create significant tax incentives to reduce the shocking income inequality between executives and their workers. We will also universalize healthcare to reduce the cost of living for seniors and those with disabilities.
For many families, the cost of childcare for 2 children is more than their rent, $11,000 a year per child. What would you do to make childcare more affordable?
The current cost of childcare is a direct result of the policies our government has supported in direct opposition to the interests of the vast majority of Americans. But relentless deregulation of global corporations including BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, massive subsidies to huge multinational companies, and catastrophic handling of crises, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, are all contributors to this issue. The COVID-19 pandemic resulted in a $3.3 trillion wealth transfer from Americans to the billionaire class. The policies that delivered this result were a betrayal of the American people. If there is ever doubt of who the political establishment works for, just look at who is taken care of during emergencies. It's not the people. A failure to regulate huge corporations out of the housing market has caused housing prices to skyrocket. Corporations like BlackRock, foreign and domestic, should be totally barred from purchasing residential housing. Their involvement has placed home ownership beyond the grasp for a disturbing percentage of millennials and younger generations. We are cannibalizing our children, and the fact that these generations are expected to do worse than their parents for the first time in our history proves it. In pursuit of infinite profit, companies including Amazon, Walmart, and McDonald's are allowed to pay tens of thousands of their workers' starvation wages, forcing workers to seek support from the government in the form of federal aid. Recent studies have shown 70% of the 21 million aid receivers have full-time employment. How much of the profits of these companies are attributed to subsidized wages from the government? This has to stop. It is time to force companies to pay a living wage for a fair day's work. The combination of the failure to encode living wages into law, the failure to advocate for Americans in times of crisis, and the failure to defend the housing market against predatory capitalist corporations has disallowed Americans to own, or even rent a home without multiple incomes and at great personal cost to them. With 2 parents working, who is left to raise any children? Because this dynamic has created the necessity of full-time childcare, parents are not only forced to pay these unprecedented rates, but viciously vie and compete against other parents for spots in highly contested quality childcare services in the hope of securing a better future for their children. We need to rebuild the middle class by ending the monopolization of quality child rearing by the elites, demanding living wages, and stopping corporate greed from interfering with our livelihood. Are you not sick and tired of living paycheck to paycheck? Are you not sick and tired of the blatant reading of the so-called free market? We must stand together and fight for the ability to live a better life. Our fight starts now. Vote for me and we will restore rightful ownership of our democracy and our economy to the people.
Opioid overdose deaths have gone up in the last two presidencies. What will you do to help Americans right now in the throes of addiction who are struggling to get the treatment they need?
Our government has thus far woefully failed to address the opioid epidemic in any meaningful way. Under my administration, we will finally take definitive action against this ongoing crisis and ensure we do not continue to repeat the mistakes of the past. To start, we will, number 1, seize every cent made by the big pharmaceutical companies through the predatory practices used to knowingly deceive and push these dangerous drugs onto the American public. Number 2, appoint a council of experts to produce a mitigation plan that will transparently use these funds to open state-of-the-art drug treatment centers, such as therapeutic farms based on the latest evidence-proven methods to treat Americans battling drug addiction. Number 3, end the total failure that is the war on drugs. Number 4, appoint a council of experts to analyze the failings of the prison industrial complex and recommend comprehensive reforms based on transitioning to a system of rehabilitation designed to minimize the likelihood of relapse. Number 5, take legal action against the pharmaceutical companies whose deeds have led to over 1 million deaths and untold damage caused to millions more. This includes launching an investigation into the degree these companies and executives were aware of the hazards associated with these drugs and the illegal, unethical practices used to push them. We will bring to justice all individuals responsible for these crimes. Number 6, restructure the funding and drug approval process of the FDA to eliminate conflicts of interest with corporations and maximize transparency of the drug review process.
Are you too old to be president of the United States?
The fact that the median age of senators in the United States is over 65 ought to raise eyebrows. Donald Trump is 78, Joe Biden is 81, Nancy Pelosi is 84, Chuck Schumer is 73, Mitch McConnell is 82. Now, if the elderly age of our politicians were a reflection of the fact that the people have sought to elect the wisest and most experienced amongst us to the halls of power, this might be overlooked and the concern it raises put to rest. We all know that this is not the case. The truth of the matter is the age of our politicians reflects a more disturbing political reality, the corporate capture of American democracy. It is no secret that huge corporations shamelessly spend enormous sums on lobbying, that is, legalized bribery. The DNC and RNC alike are funded by powerful private interests who pour funds into the campaigns of both parties to ensure that, no matter who wins, the policy of the USA will be more than friendly to them. So much for the will of the American people. In 2020, Joe Biden's campaign spent over $1 billion to get elected. Donald Trump spent over $750 million on his campaign. The congressional elections taking place that year spent a total of over $8.7 billion. These are grotesque sums. The sad reality of American democracy today is that the overwhelming majority of political leaders in this country are the ones who can collect the most donor money to fund their campaigns. These are without fail the politicians who have demonstrated their willingness to serve corporate interests. New faces and new ideas are intentionally shut out from having a fair shot at being elected to office because corporations flood their opponents with hundreds of millions of dollars. Meanwhile, those of us that seek authentic change must rely on small dollar donations from individual citizens. This allows corrupt, self-serving politicians who ally themselves with corporate power to stay in office more or less indefinitely. Corporate backers do not care if their loyal stooges drop dead on the floor of Congress, as long as they continue implementing policies that enrich their donors at the expense of the American people. No wonder America is in the position it's in today. You could say that the people in power are simply out of touch, but the reality is more dire. They are actively enabled by corporate money to serve their own interests at the expense of the American people. As H.L. Mencken once pointed out, it is difficult to get a man to understand something when his income depends on his not understanding it. We desperately need to get private money out of politics. My administration will outlaw lobbying, the revolving door, and all the rest of it. We need to ban members of Congress and the White House from making money outside of the salary of the position in government they hold. It is time for the members of government to serve the interests of the people and not the selfish agendas of their rich donors.
Will you accept the election results?
Yes.
If you have any closing statements, you may make them now.
Over the last several decades, we have seen the deeply disturbing trend of corporate power and private money successfully gaining influence over government policymaking. The evidence of this conspiracy against the American people has become undeniable. The Trump tax cuts for the rich, Biden's weak action to curb Big Pharma's price gouging, the endless spending on forever wars, the chronic disease epidemic, the failure to deliver a functional healthcare system, the sickeningly divisive partisan rhetoric espoused at all times in media and politics. Ultimately, this pattern, which has eroded trust in our institutions, is the same pattern that threatens to tear our country apart. From the handling of the opioid epidemic, where billions were made off the destruction of American lives, to the response to the migrant crisis that has disregarded the most vulnerable among us, and to the policies enacted during the COVID-19 pandemic that has set up the billionaire class to double their wealth while we struggle to make ends meet. Not to mention the financial crisis of 2008, where more than $800 billion were handed out to banks and corporations, which we were told were too big to fail. We were forced to furnish their greedy executives with parachutes laced with gold. The list of justifiable grievances the people have against these corrupt elected officials is staggering. Is it any wonder why trust in our government has been eroded so severely? The Republicans and Democrats alike have abandoned the working class as they compete in a tug of war for the honor of being the first to serve the American dream to their rich donors and crummy elite on a silver platter. And while serving the interests of the wealthy, the middle class has been gutted and the working class reduced to live in squalor with little reprieve in sight. These failures must either be explicit betrayals of the American people or a stunning display of incompetence, both of which justify their removal from power. We are tired of politicians who do not represent us, and we are sick of the establishment encouraging us to blame one another for our problems while the powers that be are free from scrutiny. The time has come to shine a light on those who have abused their power for personal gain. The time has come for all of us to unite against the forces that oppress us. We are not going to take it anymore. Today, we face an incredible opportunity. On Election Day, cast your vote in a new direction. My administration will work tirelessly to once again earn the right to be called a government of the people, by the people, for the people. The future belongs to us. Together, we can put an end to the failed ways of the past. Join me in making it a reality. It is time for our future, beginning now.
There you have it. We've walked through the responses of Candidate X, a figure who embodies the true spirit of the working class people, a candidate who represents a beacon of hope amidst the current political wasteland, bringing us a better vision of tomorrow where the downtrodden are lifted up instead of preyed upon. As we move forward, it's crucial that we, as a collective, demand more from our leaders and hold them accountable to the standards we deserve. Candidate X exemplifies the potential for a fairer, more sensible future where the voices of the many, not the few, drive our nation forward. Remember, the power to bring about change lies in our hands. By staying informed, active, and in support of leaders who are willing to radically change our country, we can make America strong again. Thank you for joining us in this exploration of what could be. Let's continue to strive for a better tomorrow together. If you enjoyed this video and you'd like to see more content from us, please like and subscribe and leave a comment. It really helps out the channel. For more information, please visit illumination.nexus or connect with us on reddit.com/thegrailsearch. Thank you for watching.